In 2018, Jessica Simmons, a 34-year-old experienced officer with the Phoenix Police Department, had spent over 10 years in law enforcement. By then, she had earned a reputation for being thorough, dependable, and highly reliable during high-stress situations. That year, she was partnered with Laura Mitchell, a young and enthusiastic officer a few years her junior. Laura had only been with the department for 5 years, but had quickly made a name for herself. Their partnership seemed to hold promise, as both shared a strong sense of duty and professionalism. In October, Laura invited Jessica to dinner at her house. Laura had recently moved in with her husband, Nick Mitchell, a 35-year-old IT specialist working for a local cybersecurity firm. Laura often spoke of Nick at work, praising how supportive he was of her career and how strong their marriage had been over the 7 years. Jessica, who lived alone, was open to connecting with her partner outside of work and eagerly accepted the invitation. The dinner took place in a cozy suburban home in Scottsdale, Arizona, where Laura and Nick resided. The evening started calmly with light conversation about work, hobbies, and some amusing recent cases. It was the relaxed atmosphere Jessica had anticipated. However, when Nick joined them, something shifted. Jessica hadn't expected much from meeting her partner's husband, as she had always focused on work and kept personal relationships at a distance. But when she met Nick, an undeniable connection was instantly felt. He was warm and approachable, with a calm demeanor that contrasted Laura's more lively personality. His deep voice and composed manner took Jessica by surprise. As the evening continued, Jessica found herself subtly drawn to him, a feeling that made her uneasy. She noticed his sharp wit, his attentive listening, and the way his gaze lingered on her during their conversations. Nick, for his part, also seemed to sense the attraction between them. Though he remained committed to Laura and never crossed any lines, his demeanor toward Jessica became increasingly warm with each meeting. He appeared more engaged in conversations with her than with anyone else, and Jessica noticed small signs suggesting he was aware of the tension between them. Sometimes, when Laura left the room, the silence between Jessica and Nick would become heavy, as if both were struggling with unspoken thoughts. By the end of 2018, Jessica found herself in a difficult situation, developing feelings for Nick despite knowing he was married to her partner and friend. The guilt weighed on her, but she couldn't stop herself from seeking him out. Every interaction with Nick left her both excited and conflicted, torn between her desires and her moral compass. She justified her actions by convincing herself it was harmless, that no one was getting hurt, and that her feelings would eventually fade. By early 2019, Jessica and Nick spent more time together, not only socially, but also due to work-related circumstances. Laura, often preoccupied with administrative tasks or managing other cases, left Jessica to handle specific assignments alone. Fortunately, Nick's expertise in cybersecurity came in handy during several investigations, offering Jessica a legitimate reason to contact him outside of Laura's presence. The first joint investigation occurred in February 2019, when a local bank reported a series of cyber attacks targeting their security systems. With Laura busy with another case, Jessica took the lead. Aware of the complexity of the crime, she immediately thought of Nick and reached out to him for assistance. Nick agreed without hesitation, eager to help. Their professional collaboration started on a strictly business basis. Jessica appreciated Nick's efficiency and expertise, while Nick respected Jessica's sharp investigative skills. However, as they spent more time together, reviewing data and tracking leads, the underlying tension resurfaced. Their conversations gradually shifted from work-related topics to more personal discussions. Jessica found herself enjoying these moments, sensing a bond that transcended their work or their friendship with Laura. By March, their relationship had deepened into something more complicated, and they began to share personal details neither had previously revealed. Nick opened up to Jessica about his work frustrations and the stress of managing a team, as well as the strain on his marriage. Jessica listened attentively, feeling a mix of empathy and guilt. She understood that Nick's marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared. As they grew closer, Jessica's guilt intensified. She knew she was betraying Laura, not through actions, but through her feelings. Every day she told herself she needed to distance herself from Nick before things escalated. But every time they met, her resolve faltered. The connection between them was undeniable, and resisting it felt impossible. Nick, too, struggled. He had always been loyal to Laura, never imagining he would feel this way about anyone else. But Jessica was different. She understood him in ways Laura didn't, and their shared experiences at work created a bond that felt effortless. Nick found himself thinking about Jessica more frequently, wondering what might have happened if their paths had crossed under different circumstances. Over the next few months, Jessica and Nick continued working together on various cases, and each collaboration only strengthened the tension between them. They no longer needed excuses to meet. Work provided plenty of opportunities. Their conversations became more intimate, and silences between them were charged with unspoken feelings. It was as though they were both waiting for the other to make the first move, but neither was ready to cross that line just yet. In April, their partnership on a particularly challenging case brought them even closer. They spent long hours together, often working late into the night. During one of these late sessions, as they sat in the dimly lit office reviewing files, the air between them grew thick with tension. Jessica could feel the unspoken emotions hanging in the air, and she knew Nick felt the same. There was a moment when their eyes met, and for a brief second, she thought he might say something, acknowledge what was happening between them. As the months passed, the emotional strain began to take its toll on Jessica. She found it increasingly difficult to focus on her work, her thoughts continually drifting back to Nick. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the desire. She was trapped in a web of her own making, unable to escape the feelings that consumed her. Nick, too, struggled. His marriage to Laura, once a source of happiness, now felt burdensome. He couldn't ignore the strong connection he had with Jessica, but the thought of betraying Laura held him back from acting on his feelings. Despite never taking concrete steps to act on their emotions, the emotional affair between Jessica and Nick was undeniable. By the fall of 2019, Jessica could no longer deny her feelings for him. What had started as an innocent friendship had become something far deeper. Now every time she saw Nick with Laura, a sense of jealousy gnawed at her. It wasn't just that she wanted to be with Nick, but that Laura stood in her way. Watching them together became almost unbearable. Laura, completely unaware of the growing tension, made Jessica's pain worse. Every time she saw them laughing or sharing a private moment, it felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Jessica couldn't help but compare herself to Laura, believing she would make Nick happier than Laura ever could. The jealousy continued to fester, growing stronger with each passing day. Her jealousy wasn't just about being with Nick, it was also about feeling an injustice. She believed that she and Nick shared something unique, something Laura could never understand. The more time she spent with them, the more convinced she became that Nick was trapped in a marriage that no longer brought him fulfillment. Jessica believed that if it weren't for Laura, she and Nick could be truly happy together. In her mind, Laura was the sole obstacle preventing their happiness. This jealousy quickly evolved into darker thoughts. Jessica began to obsess over Laura, examining her every action, word, and interaction with Nick. She began to view Laura not just as a colleague, but as a competitor, someone she had to outmaneuver. The belief that Laura was less deserving of Nick than she was took root in Jessica's mind. She started to feel that Laura's presence in Nick's life was an injustice, and that removing her was the only way to set things right. Initially, these thoughts were fleeting, passing through Jessica's mind during moments of weakness. But over time, they became more persistent. She would lie awake at night replaying the interactions between Nick and Laura, contemplating what could happen if Laura were no longer around. These thoughts frightened her at first. She had never imagined herself capable of such actions. Yet, the more she considered it, the more the idea seemed to make sense. Jessica began to picture her life without Laura in it, imagining herself and Nick together, free from the constraints of his marriage. They could be truly happy without the constant reminder of Laura standing in the way. To Jessica, this seemed like the most logical solution. If Laura were gone, everything would fall into place. Despite these increasingly intrusive thoughts, Jessica wasn't ready to act on them. She knew what she was considering was dangerous, not just for Laura, but for herself as well. As an experienced officer, she understood the risks involved in entertaining such ideas. The logical part of her mind urged her to let go, to walk away before things got worse. But the emotional side, the part that was in love with Nick, couldn't let go. As Jessica's jealousy grew, so did her resentment toward Laura. Every time they worked together or she saw Laura with Nick, her anger simmered just beneath the surface. Jessica became more irritable, snapping at Laura over minor things during their shifts. She despised the fact that Laura appeared oblivious to what was happening between her and Nick, as if their bond meant nothing. This resentment fueled her desire to eliminate Laura from the equation. Though Jessica hadn't yet formed a concrete plan, the idea of getting rid of Laura occupied more and more of her thoughts. She began to see opportunities where she hadn't before, moments when Laura was vulnerable, times when something could go wrong. With her training as a police officer, Jessica knew how to commit the perfect crime, and she couldn't help but think about how easy it might be to make Laura's death appear accidental. These thoughts terrified Jessica initially, but over time, she grew more comfortable with them. She rationalized that she wasn't really planning to harm Laura. She was just considering possibilities, thinking through scenarios. However, deep down, Jessica knew that if the right opportunity arose, she might not be able to resist. The jealousy had taken over, clouding her judgment and pushing her toward a path she had never imagined. By late 2019, Jessica's thoughts of removing Laura had evolved from fleeting fantasies into serious contemplation. She began thinking about what it would take to eliminate Laura without raising suspicion. She considered Laura's habits, her routines, and the dangerous situations they sometimes found themselves in as police officers. It wouldn't be difficult, Jessica realized, to make it look like Laura had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. By early 2020, Jessica's thoughts had turned into a well-thought-out plan. She spent months observing Laura, studying her habits, and identifying the perfect opportunity for an accident. As a seasoned officer, Jessica understood how investigations worked and was determined to create a scenario that would be almost impossible to trace back to her. The key, she knew, was timing. A high-risk situation would provide the perfect cover for something to go wrong. In March 2020, they received a call about an armed robbery. Exactly the type of situation Jessica had been waiting for. The chaos of a shootout would provide her with the chance to act. She planned to make it look like Laura was caught in the crossfire. It would require precision, but Jessica was confident she could pull it off. In the days leading up to the robbery, Jessica distanced herself from Laura, keeping their interactions strictly professional. She couldn't afford any mistakes. She'd spent too much time preparing for this moment, and now everything was falling into place. The night before the robbery, Jessica lay awake, going over her plan one final time. She knew the layout of the store, the likely behavior of the suspect, and every potential outcome. She had rehearsed the sequence of events so many times that it felt like second nature. Now, all she had to do was execute. On the day of the operation, Jessica arrived at the precinct calm and composed. She greeted Laura as usual, though there was a strange detachment in her demeanor. As they positioned themselves at the robbery scene, Jessica's heart raced. The suspect was armed, and the tension was palpable. Staying close behind Laura, Jessica waited for the perfect moment. In the chaos of the shootout, she knew she could make her move without being detected. It would all be over in an instant. When the suspect raised his weapon, Jessica saw her chance. She took a deep breath, her hand hovering over her gun, prepared to act. On March 15, 2020, Jessica and Laura were dispatched to a convenience store in Dayton, Ohio, after receiving a call about an armed robbery in progress. The store was located in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, not far from the police station, but the situation was far from ordinary. The suspect was armed and had taken a store clerk hostage, demanding money from the register. As Jessica and Laura approached, the atmosphere was tense, knowing that any mistake could be deadly. Jessica, who had meticulously planned this moment, felt her heart race, not out of fear, but with anticipation. She had rehearsed every possible scenario in her mind, and now the time had come to put her plan into action. The store's narrow layout, with shelves blocking visibility from the entrance, made it difficult to see the suspect. He had positioned himself behind the counter, partially obscured by the shelves. Jessica and Laura crouched low, taking cover while assessing the situation. As the senior officer on the scene, Laura took charge, instructing Jessica to follow her lead. Together, they moved toward the store's entrance, and Laura shouted commands for the suspect to drop his weapon and surrender. The suspect, a man in his late 20s, appeared agitated. His gun was still pointed at the clerk, and he was sweating, clearly panicked, and ready to act recklessly. Jessica stayed just behind Laura, scanning the room but always returning her focus to her partner's back. She had waited for this moment, and now it was within her grasp. The chaos of the robbery, the danger, and the tension provided the perfect cover for her to act. Laura, focused entirely on the suspect, was unaware of the danger looming behind her. As the suspect raised his gun toward them, Laura stepped forward slightly, moving into the line of fire. At that exact moment, Jessica saw her opportunity. Her breath caught as she made her move. With cold precision, she aimed her gun at Laura's back and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed loudly in the small store, deafening in the enclosed space. Laura staggered forward, her body jerking as the bullet struck. Within seconds, Jessica shifted her position and fired at the suspect. Distracted by the officers, the suspect didn't notice Jessica's maneuver. Her shot hit the shelves near him, but the chaos of the moment made it appear as though the gunfire had come from the suspect's weapon. Panicked, the suspect fired back in Jessica's direction, his shots erratic and wild, further supporting her story. The gunfight ended as quickly as it had begun. Laura collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath her. Jessica immediately radioed for backup, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Officer down, shots fired, suspect is armed, she said urgently, making sure to convey the gravity of the situation without revealing her true role. As other officers arrived, Jessica knelt beside Laura, pressing her hands to the wound, as if trying to stop the bleeding. It was a futile effort. Laura was already slipping away. In those few moments, Jessica played her part perfectly. She was the concerned partner, desperately trying to save her colleague, her face contorted with a mix of fear and grief. She kept her hands on Laura's wound, even though deep down, she knew there was no hope. Laura's breaths grew shallow, and within minutes, she was gone. Paramedics arrived shortly after, but by then, it was too late. They confirmed what Jessica already knew. Laura was dead. As investigators combed the scene for evidence, Jessica stood apart from the others, her face a mask of sorrow. In her mind, she replayed the moments over and over. The shot, the fall, the aftermath. She had pulled the trigger, ending Laura's life, but no one would ever know. The guilt that had gnawed at her for weeks was now replaced by a strange numbness. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Despite the horror of what had occurred, Jessica felt an odd sense of relief. Laura was gone, and now nothing stood between her and Nick. It was a twisted justification, but in Jessica's mind, it made sense. She had done what she had to do to secure her future and eliminate the obstacle that stood between her and the life she wanted. The official report, filed later that night, described the events as a tragic accident. According to the report, Laura had been shot by the suspect during the exchange of gunfire, and despite Jessica's efforts to save her, she had died from her injuries at the scene. The suspect's weapon was found to have discharged during the altercation, which further corroborated Jessica's story. It was an open and shut case. As Jessica drove home that night, the reality of what she had done began to settle in. She had taken a life, not in the heat of battle or self-defense, but out of cold, calculated desire. She had orchestrated the death of her partner, someone she had worked alongside and someone who had trusted her. But in her mind, it was all worth it. Laura was gone, and now she could move forward, closer to Nick and the life she had envisioned. After Laura's death, Jessica and Nick grew closer, bound by shared grief and the trauma of losing someone so dear. In the days following the funeral, Nick leaned heavily on Jessica for support. To the outside world, it seemed like a natural progression. Two people connected by the same tragedy, finding comfort in each other. Jessica, however, felt a deeper, darker satisfaction. Her plan had worked perfectly, and now she was the one in Nick's life, someone who could understand his pain. But despite this, a sense of unease gnawed at Jessica. Unbeknownst to her, there were already whispers within the department. Some investigators had noticed inconsistencies in the ballistics report. The angle of the bullet that killed Laura didn't quite match the position of the suspect during the shootout. At first, this was dismissed as a minor discrepancy, but as more forensic evidence came in, it became harder to ignore. Investigators also found Jessica's behavior following the shooting to be unusual. While her grief appeared genuine, there were subtle moments when she seemed too composed, too calculated for someone who had just lost a partner. The turning point came when the department obtained surveillance footage from a nearby store. The camera didn't capture the actual shooting inside the convenience store, but it did record the moments before and after. Investigators noticed that Jessica's positioning didn't match her initial statement. She had claimed to be directly behind Laura, firing at the suspect as he shot her, but the footage showed her taking a different approach. Her movements seemed deliberate, almost as if she were positioning herself for something. On April 10, 2020, nearly a month after Laura's death, Jessica was called into the police station for what was described as a routine follow-up interview. When she arrived, she was met by 2 detectives from the Internal Affairs Division. They asked her to recount the events of the shooting again, probing deeper into the details. This time, Jessica could feel the tension in the room, but she remained calm, sticking to her original story. It wasn't until they presented the surveillance footage and pointed out the discrepancies that her calm began to crack. The detectives then revealed the ballistics report, showing how the bullet that killed Laura didn't match the trajectory of the suspect's gun. At that moment, Jessica knew she had made a fatal mistake. She had overlooked the one detail that would bring everything down. The forensic evidence was enough to unravel her carefully constructed lie. Within hours, her world began to collapse. The investigators had gathered enough to place her under arrest, charging her with the murder of her partner. The trial that followed was brutal. The prosecution laid out every detail of Jessica's plan, from the moment she decided to kill Laura to the execution of the murder during the robbery. They presented forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, and testimony from other officers who had begun to suspect her. The jury listened in disbelief as the case unfolded. Jessica, once a respected officer, was now exposed as a manipulative murderer. For Nick, the trial was a nightmare. He had lost his wife, and now he had to face the painful truth that the woman he had grown close to, the woman who had been there for him in his grief, was responsible for Laura's death. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. He sat through each day of the trial, his eyes vacant, unable to process how everything had fallen apart so completely. On May 24, 2021, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Jessica was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, she caught one last glimpse of Nick. He didn't say a word or look her in the eye. For him, there was nothing left to say. His life had been shattered by the person he had come to trust. In that moment, Jessica realized the full weight of her actions. Not only had she killed Laura, but she had also lost any chance at the life she had wanted with Nick. Jessica would spend the rest of her life behind bars, haunted by the consequences of her choices. Nick, meanwhile, was left alone, broken by the betrayal and the loss of the 2 most important people in his life.